Good afternoon, everyone. Wow, that was really good. Wow. I want to thank everyone for coming. My name is Dr. Lorraine Martin. I am the Martin Luther King Jr. Centennial Professor here at Stanford, and I am also the director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. Our mission at the King Institute is to preserve and promote the work and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. And so, as you would imagine from our guest today, this book is right in line with the work that we do. Our primary research output is the King Papers Project, which is led by Tanisha Armstrong, and we have several of our folks here today who work with us as well. Bryn and Jordan over there, I want to thank them for all the work that they do. And I also want to thank the Stanford Center for Racial Justice for helping us to make this event possible, as well as the program in creative writing here at Stanford, the Department of English, and the Department of Communication. So I want to thank all of those groups for making this possible. And with that, I think I will get to why all of you are here to introduce our speaker and our author for today. Leta McCollough Seletzky is a National Endowment for the Arts 2022 Creative Writing Fellow. She's a litigator, so she's right at home here at Stanford Law, turned essayist and writer, and her work has appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Griot, The Washington Post, the Oprah Magazine, and now elsewhere as well. She holds a BA from Northwestern University and a JD from the George Washington University Law School. She grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and now lives in Walnut Creek, California. And of course, she is now the author of this amazing book that all of you are here to talk about and hear us to discuss today. And also has now been everywhere. She's been at the National Spy Museum, you've been at Oxford, you've been all over with this book, and now we're so thankful that you're adding Stanford University to that list. So please join me in welcoming Leta here today. So we'll have a conversation about the book, and then we'll turn to you for a time of question and answer. And afterwards, there's books here available, and our author has agreed to sign books when we conclude. So before we get into the text of the book, I would love just to hear from you about the origins of this book. Talk to us about how did this thing become a book?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Martin, for inviting me to be here. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and to the university and the various schools here for supporting this wonderful event. And so the origin story of the book. For most of my life, I tried to put as much distance as I could between myself and that photograph that's on the cover of the book and the entire story. And it's a photograph that you really can't escape if you're talking about American history, particularly in the 20th century, particularly when it comes to Dr. King and the civil rights movement, the 1960s. So as long as I can remember, I mean, this photo has been a part of my life. And I knew from an early age that it was my father who was kneeling over Dr. King in the photograph. I remember my mom, who at the time was a newspaper reporter, and I was 4 or 5 years old, showing my little brother and me this photograph and saying that, you know, this was my father. He was a Memphis police officer. And that's all she said. And so I just kind of, you know, over time got the idea that that was all that would be said about this picture, at least in our house. What I didn't know until I started working on the book was that was just about all she knew. She didn't really know that much about the story. And of course, you know, my parents, well, they had split when I was 3 years old. They got divorced, and it was an acrimonious divorce. And I can remember vividly, you know, the arguments and the upheaval and moving from Northern Virginia, where I was born, to my mom's hometown of Memphis. So to me, just the discomfort about the photograph and the silence about it was all bound up with this idea of the divorce and the rift and the bad relationship that my mom and my dad had. So for all these reasons, we just didn't talk about it. Nobody talked about it for a long time. When I was a teenager, I read in my hometown newspaper, the Memphis Commercial Appeal, this article. I was just perusing the newspaper because I lived in kind of a newspaper household with my mom being a reporter, and then she married another reporter at the paper. So I read the newspaper, like 15, come home from school, reading the Metro section, whatever. And I saw this article about this assassination, this photograph. And then I saw, there's a black police officer who had infiltrated a black militant group that was in Memphis. Oh, well, that's interesting. Wait, that's my dad's name, Marrell McCollough. And I was shocked. I did not know. I knew that he was a Memphis police officer. I didn't know that he was a mole in this black militant group in Memphis called the Invaders, which was kind of like the Black Panthers in a way. I mean, I had never heard of the Invaders, but, I was very aware of the Black Panthers. And in fact, I read one of the memoirs from one of the former members, and I was all about Huey Newton. I was like a big Black Panther supporter. So I was scandalized. I wondered, how could a black man in Memphis in 1968, which, it was basically still Jim Crow, how could he infiltrate a group that was, fighting for black freedom, by all appearances, and report back to the police? And so, it wasn't the kind of thing that I felt free to talk about. In fact, I asked my little brother later, after the book was out, did we ever talk about that? When I saw that article and I was, and he said that, he's 2 years younger than I am. He said, I remember that you brought it up and that you were mad, but that's all. Because, I never made a big issue about it. I just thought, well, I just don't want to hear about this at school. Who else has seen this article? Am I going to have to answer questions about this in high school? It was just really embarrassing. And I just didn't want anything to do with it. And then also, thinking back to the silence about the photograph, then it started to take on this kind of sinister cast. So I was just like, well, that's him. That's not me. My parents got divorced when I was 3 years old. He didn't even, bring me up. So I'm just going to move on with my life, which I did. Left Memphis, went away to college, went to law school, and just built what I thought was going to be this great life apart from any of this. Why does this have to define me? It doesn't. But what I realized after I started having kids, so I was practicing law in Houston, Texas. I had my eldest son, who's now 16, and took some time off from work, went back to work. I'm litigating everything. Then I had my second son, who's now 13, and I took the maternity leave again. And then I'm like, trying to be a litigator and having these babies, it's a lot. I'm gonna go part-time. But then I quickly realized that there's really, being a part-time litigator, it doesn't really work. When you have litigation, you just have to jump on it. So I ended up just saying, okay, well, I'm going to just put my career on hold and be with my kids for now. And, I'll still maintain my law licenses and everything. So I did that. But so now I've got this time and to really just sit and focus on other things, other than litigation. I'm thinking about the kids. I'm thinking about legacy. And in particular, I'm thinking, what am I going to tell these kids about their grandfather, Granddaddy Mac? Because I don't even know. There's this photo. And of course, in between all of this, from being a kid and seeing the picture in the newspaper till now, there's been, the advent of the internet. So I've gone online. I've searched his name. I've seen these awful claims about my dad saying, essentially, he was involved in the murder of Dr. King because he was an undercover cop. Oh, and I guess I should have mentioned also that, a few years after this photo was taken, this was 1968. In 1974, he became a Central Intelligence Agency officer. Okay, so yeah, little detail. And so, putting it all together, some folks looked at all this and they were like, clearly, this man is someone who should be looked at, And so I didn't know what to think, but once I had my second son, I decided that it just, it was one thing for me not to know the story and to try to live with that, but it wasn't right to pass down that legacy of silence to another generation. And so that is the origin story of the book in a nutshell. I mean, a lot happens after that. I have to bring it up, so Dad, the assassination, we never talked about it. We really did have to have this awkward conversation, but that's the origin story in a nutshell.
So you decided to take on this task of writing this book, in a sense, to make sense of it for yourself, but also thinking about your children.
Yes.
And how they would make sense of it as they became adults. So talk to us about what you discovered. Mac, your father grows up in Mississippi. He signs up to go into the military. He serves his 3 years. He comes home back. He moves to Memphis with family members and becomes a police officer.
Right. Which, so there's a lot that brings him down that path. So first of all, growing up in Mississippi, Black man born the fourth of 12 children in Tunica County, Mississippi in 1944, which is, this is one of the poorest counties in, one of the poorest states in America. So the conditions were awful. But he still remembers it as a happy childhood. But then there's a lot of upheaval. First of all, this is the heat of Jim Crow, racial terrorism, and just very just stark segregation that had become normalized, in the communities in which he lived. But he grew up that way. His mother ended up dying when he was very young, 5 years old. Family falls into disarray. He ends up getting delayed in even beginning school. So by the time he starts school, he just walks into the schoolhouse with his little brother and says, "Hey, I'm supposed to be in second grade, and my little brother, you put him in first." And so they're like, okay. So anyway, he goes through school, but what ends up happening is, and he loves school. He's a very talented student. He wants to go on to higher education, but he knows that the only way that he could possibly, pay for college or go to college would be through the GI Bill. So he becomes part of this sort of school to military pipeline, which, still exists for so many people. If you're low income, particularly in communities that are marginalized, a lot of times the military is the way to gain some upward mobility. So that's what he does. He ends up getting essentially kind of hornswoggled into dropping out of high school, which is its own story. So, he goes to the military thinking he's going to finish high school, which, no, that's not a thing. He's going to have to get his GED. So he goes and does his 3 years, ends up getting assigned to become a military policeman. That's where they put him. So, he goes through the training, does that, works in different places, does his 3 years. Just as Vietnam is heating up, it's time for him to be discharged. And unlike some of the guys who wanted to kind of stay on in the military and go see combat, they're all gung-ho, they want to extend their service to go fight. He was like, I did my duty, I'm getting my, my GI Bill, I'm going home. So he does that. He gets discharged in 1967. And rather than go back to Mississippi, he wants to now, start this life and hopefully have some kind of career. And so he goes to Memphis, which, it's kind of probably the closest big city to, where he grew up and where he had family. And he has some family members in Memphis. So goes back to Memphis, and he's like, okay, now I'm going to get a job. Only one problem. He can't get a job. So he's going, knocking on doors, basically, looking at the classifieds, pounding the pavement day after day. Nobody will hire him. He's got a GED. He just got out of the military. He's a black man, and nobody hires him. So he ends up working these menial jobs for his cousin, Eugene, who is, he's got kind of a managerial type of role, but these are still kind of, menial jobs. One of them is at a sash and door warehouse, Memphis sash and door. And then the other one is at a motorboat engine repair shop. So they're working these jobs. So they get up, at 5 a.m. or whatever. It's still dark. They go and they work their shift at Memphis Sash and Door, and then they leave there, and then they go drive over to the motorboat repair shop, and then they work their shift there, and they come home, eat dinner, go to bed, do it again. And that's the way it is, day after day. And, my dad's making minimum wage, and that is what his life is. Until one day, they're on their way to Memphis Sash and Door one morning, and this ad comes on the radio. They usually listen to some talk radio or something, and an ad comes on, and it's like the sound of a siren, like, woo, woo, be a Memphis police officer. We are recruiting, come down to the, the main police department, your headquarters on Adams Street, and apply to be a police officer today. So Eugene, who's driving, he's like, hey, Mac, didn't you used to be a military police officer? And he's like, yeah. He's like, well, you ought to go apply to be a Memphis police officer. And my dad's like, they aren't going to hire any Negro police officer. And Eugene says, well, you don't know that. You ought to go try. So he's like, he thinks it's pointless. He's already tried to get a job, and jobs that require much less responsibility than being a police officer got turned down every time. So he thinks it's pointless. But on the other hand, he doesn't want to disappoint Eugene, who, after all, has, given him these jobs and really believes in him. So he's like, okay, well, all I have to do is just go down there, pick up the application, and if it'll make Eugene happy, then at least I can just fill it out and I can say I tried. So he does that. Well, actually, no, it's not so simple. He drops Eugene off at Memphis Sash and Door, goes down to police headquarters, and what ensues is a day long, and I mean the whole rest of the day till like midnight almost, of jumping through these hoops to fill out this application. It turns out this is the last day to apply for the Memphis Police Department. And he doesn't have, his driver's license expired. He's got to go get a letter proving his identity, and he's got to find his high school principal, who turns out was in the hospital somewhere. So he's got to drive all over Mississippi. Finally secures all of these, whatever he needs. Then, because it's the last day to apply, he's got to sit there in police headquarters at the end of the day, fill out this application, put it in, and then they're like, oh, you're not done. You got to take the civil service exam. It's about to start. So he has to go and do that. Anyway, after completing these tasks, yes, he becomes a Memphis police officer, pending his physical examination, which he ultimately did pass, yes.
And having to buy his own uniform, his own revolver.
Yes.
All these things. So he becomes a police officer, and this is 1967.
That's right.
And Martin Luther King Jr. in the early of 68 is invited to come to Memphis for the sanitation workers strike. And Mac is asked to do undercover work. Tell us a little bit about the kind of undercover work he begins doing fairly quickly.
Fairly quickly. I mean, as you can imagine, this is another one of those tales that's just so much happens in a short period of time. Okay, so he starts off, he goes to the police academy, and then graduates in early December and ends up being on foot patrol at a shopping center during the busy Christmas shopping season. Does that, it's all normal. And then he does it for a while, and then he gets assigned to the car patrols. Does that. That's fine. Everything's normal. Then, suddenly, February 1968, sanitation strike in Memphis pops off. So the sanitation workers in Memphis, the vast majority of whom were black, had been mistreated for a long time. underpaid, making poverty wages, in some cases below the federal minimum wage, because they were paid, I believe, by the routes that they worked rather than, just getting paid for their time. They were, of course, everything was segregated. They had no facilities that they could use. They couldn't shower up. They couldn't shelter. So what ended up happening was, and they had no union, of course. They wanted to unionize, and we're not allowed to do that. Well, and so they're just getting walked on and just treated. I mean, this was like, the conditions were deplorable. So there's a rainstorm and there's a downpour. A couple of these sanitation workers had nowhere to take shelter except in the back of the garbage truck where the compactor is. And the compactor malfunctioned and crushed them to death. A grisly death. And so this outrages and galvanizes the sanitation workers. And so they basically are like, okay, we don't even need to hold a vote. Like, we're not working anymore until this all changes. And we want like a union dues checkoff, and we want to get paid better, and, we want better working conditions. And so there's a garbage strike, basically, sanitation worker strike. The trash is not getting picked up, and so it starts to pile up. It becomes a big emergency in the city, and then there are these reports coming in to law enforcement that, the city, of course, has tried to hire some scabs to run some of the trucks. And there's reports coming in that people are interfering with the collection of the garbage by the scabs. People are shooting at them. These are the reports. So the police officers are assigned to work these extra shifts, escorting the scabs in the garbage trucks. So my dad gets caught up doing that. Then he gets assigned, in addition to his regular car patrols, he's got to spend like 12 hours, whatever, just like escorting the scabs. Then he gets assigned to sit at a landfill and just watch and see, like, is anyone coming to, mess up the garbage? I don't know, block the trucks, which nothing happens that he sees. Then he gets this call from the assistant chief of police, Lux, saying, yeah, Matt, can you come on down to my office? Just one day in February. So he's like, okay, sure. Goes down to the office, and, he gets in there, and there's a couple of the black officers who are there, and then some folks from the Memphis Police Department's intelligence bureau. They have their own intelligence bureau. And so what my dad and this other black patrolman are asked to do is to go down to one of these mass meetings that the strike supporters are having at one of the local churches, Claiborne Temple. Just go down in your plain clothes and just listen and see what they're doing. Like, see if they're planning on interfering with the garbage collection, and just report back. Just go listen and just tell us, like, what are they saying? So he and his black colleague are like, okay, I mean, it's better than sitting in the landfill. So he goes back to his, apartment, changes clothes, puts on his plain clothes, goes down to Claiborne Temple, listens, and he doesn't hear anybody planning anything, like, nefarious. And so he does that, and so now he's on his way to becoming an undercover guy, like, and in fact, during one of these meetings, his black colleague ends up getting outed as a police officer because, I mean, these officers have been seen before as police. So hello, it's just, my dad was a rookie. This guy had been on the force longer. So of course somebody's like, hey, he's a cop, and they, ran him out of there. But my dad didn't get outed. So he continues to just go day after day, and he can keep a low profile, And he does this successfully, and the folks at the police department are so impressed. They're like, hey, there's these guys known as the Invaders, and, we're worried that they might try to radicalize the strike supporters and try to inspire them to cause some kind of civil disturbance. So maybe see if you can, get involved with them and befriend them, and, just let us know what they're doing. And so this was the doorway through which my dad walked that led him to that photograph.
So talk to us a little bit about that. He's embedded with this organization, the Invaders. He becomes really well liked in part because he has a car.
Minister of Transportation.
He's the Minister of Transportation. He's driving folks around. And he ends up meeting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He's at the Lorraine Hotel. So talk to us about that day. I want to talk a little bit about the day of April 4th and all that Mac experienced and all that he saw.
Yes. So April 4th started out like any other day. You know, my dad gets up, gets dressed, goes down to Claiborne Temple, which was one of the nerve centers of the strike supporters, looks around, let me see what the Invaders are up to today, And the first people that he sees are these two women who are, they're black women who are students at Memphis State University. And they're talking to one of Dr. King's cohorts, a man named James Orange, Reverend James Orange, who they called Baby Jesus, which is kind of like this ironic nickname because he's like a huge man, so they called him Baby Jesus. So he sees these two women talking to Baby Jesus. And as he walks up, one of the women says, hey, maybe Matt can help us, And so he's like, or maybe Matt can drive us. And he says, drive you where? And Baby Jesus says he needs to go shopping for Dr. King's upcoming march in Memphis. Dr. King had staged a march previously in Memphis in support of the sanitation workers. Unfortunately, that march descended into chaos. And so he had come back to Memphis to lead a peaceful march in advance of his Poor People's Campaign march, which was going to be a massive demonstration on Washington. So anyway, Baby Jesus needed some 4-button overalls to wear to the march because this was like, the look for the march for the people, like the peasant farmer look. And so, but he's a very large man, so they got to find the 4-button overalls in his size. So, as the Minister of Transportation, my dad, Mac, says, oh yeah, sure, I'll drive you, and so he takes Baby Jesus. The two women drive, in their own car, so they're kind of tailing him. So they hit up all the stores. They go downtown, go to the big, downtown department store, Goldsmiths. They don't have the overalls. They go all over town, never found the overalls. And so then they go back to Claiborne Temple because it's the end of the day, basically, so everybody's kind of reassembling. And so then they run into James Bevel, another one of Dr. King's cohorts in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And by this time, everybody's kind of figuring out what they're going to do for dinner. And so anyway, the Bevel and Orange end up deciding, why don't we just invite the girls, we'll all go to dinner. We'll figure it out. Let's go back to the Lorraine, which is where Dr. King and the SCLC folks were staying. And they had also gotten a room at the Lorraine for the Invaders because they were in talks with the Invaders to get the Invaders' assistance, or at least buy-in, to have a peaceful march this time and not one that ended in violence, because if they had another march that didn't work out, then this was going to jeopardize Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign, which was, his huge vision, and this is where Dr. King, was turning to kind of economic rights. And so this is going to be a big thing. So, but first he had to show that he could do this in Memphis before he led, this march on the nation's capital. Anyway, they all, they pile into these two cars. Bevel and Baby Jesus are riding with my dad, and then the women follow in their car. They pull up to the Lorraine. At this time, it's about 6 in the evening or so. And, pull into the parking lot, and they look up, and Dr. King is standing out on the balcony, on the second floor. And he's standing out there, and there's kind of a crowd gathered, and he's talking to this crowd below. And so, they've parked their cars, they're getting out, and it's a spectacle, because it's wow, here's Dr. King, he's talking to all these people. And So, I mean, they're really, Dad and Bevel and baby Jesus and the women, they really have just gotten out of their cars and they're kind of coming closer to see, really to hear what Dr. King is saying. And then there's this thunderous boom, and Dr. King falls. And instantly, my dad recognizes, that was a gunshot. He's been shot. And, he's got, at this point, he's got military training. He's got police academy training. Like, he knows guns. He's got experience with that. And unlike most of us, in an active shooter situation, most of us are going to go away from the shooting. He goes into the active shooter situation because his first thought is, somebody's got to help Dr. King. Like, he's thinking first aid. Like, this person is wounded. We've got to, somebody's got to attempt first aid. So there are these external staircases leading up to the second floor balcony. He runs up one of the staircases, drops down to a crawl. There's a cleaning cart up there. He grabs a towel, crawls over to Dr. King. And he's thinking like, okay, what do you do? It's gunshot. He's been shot in the face, basically. And so the only thing you can really do is just apply pressure, which he does with the towel. And so that is what that photograph shows.
So your Mac has been working undercover. He has been supplying evidence and information to the police department, and these reports have also gone to the FBI.
That's right.
And he witnesses this shooting. And not to be gruesome, but as part of the story, the nature of the wound really causes him fairly quickly to wonder about the weapon that was used and from where the weapon was shot. So could you say a little bit about that?
Yes, that's right. So my dad noticed a few things. First of all, when he got to Dr. King, he is noticing that there's some odors in the air. There's the smell of cologne that Dr. King had just put on because he was about to go to dinner. I'm sorry, it's a lot. So there's the smell of the cologne, which my dad actually said, this is one thing that he did tell my mom when they were married. They never talked about this very much. But one thing that he did say was that there was a particular cologne that he could not stand the smell of, like to that day, because it took him there. Yeah. There's a smell of cologne. And then also there was this facial depilatory that Dr. King used to, instead of shaving with a razor, some people get razor bumps. So he would use like this facial depilatory that has kind of like this, sometimes they can have that little like rotten egg, kind of like, sulfurous smell. It's like the burning hair smell, I guess. So he smelled that under the cologne. But there was another odor that he smelled, which he was certain, and is still certain to this day, was the smell of gunpowder. And that was unusual because it's one thing to smell gunpowder, where a gun is fired. But it's a totally different thing to smell gunpowder where the bullet lodges. The other thing that he noticed was the appearance of the wound. As you mentioned, it looked, and I don't want to be overly graphic, but it just looked like it was like it looked like there was an explosion there. It was like extruded, And then, there were these little pinpoints of blood on Dr. King's torso, like on the front of his shirt. And just putting it all together in his mind, he just concluded one thing about that bullet, which was that the bullet had exploded. Which, he had some experience with firearms. He had never heard of anything like this. What kind of bullet would that be? But that was his impression.
And to this picture where everyone's pointing across to this boarding house, your father, given his experience, looks at Dr. King, figures out the trajectory, that he believes that it came from above and kind of came down at an angle. But say a little bit about the aftermath, because the aftermath, in part, is what brings up, until this day, some of the conspiracy ideas and theories around this assassination because of how things played out after Dr. King is taken to the hospital. So talk to us a little bit about what happens then.
Right. So the aftermath, for my dad, and a lot of the narrative is through his eyes. So for him, he kind of sat around and waited to be interviewed because the police, arrived in force, on the scene, firefighters and everything. And so they tell everybody, everybody who was there, don't leave because we want to talk to you, so just wait until, we get a chance to talk to you. So he waits around and nobody ever talks to him, which, that seems a little sloppy, but okay. So he just waits around and then he's like, well, I got to get back to work because I got to see, what are the invaders about to do now? Because, this had been a period, in a long period of urban unrest. You can only imagine what was expected to happen in Memphis and other cities, that night of Dr. King's murder. So he leaves to go find the invaders. However, this aftermath, and this is something that I learned about, through just kind of researching. My dad has no firsthand knowledge of this, but there was an underbrush area behind these ramshackle buildings from which the shot came. And, it was kind of all overgrown, like weeds and grass. And so, one would think, all of this is crime scene. And somehow, immediately, within a day or something, was it the Parks Department or maybe it's, come in and they cleared it. They cleared out everything. Now, this isn't something that I investigated for the book because it was, beyond the scope of the narrative, but, it's very striking and it's very uncanny. And in fact, it is, it is mentioned in the book though, because we had a chance to talk to another one of Dr. King's cohorts who was on that balcony as well in the photograph, Ambassador Andrew Young. And so, he was extremely disturbed, of course, rightfully so, by this very strange action. And then there are some other just weird details that, to me, they just never, I can't square them. There's a story about a black police officer who was assigned to the fire department. Again, this is kind of beyond the scope of the book, but I do know that he claims that, shortly before the assassination or whatever, he was reassigned away from that post where if he had been there, he would have been there around the time of the assassination. He was assigned somewhere else. There's lots of just weird little things that add up to be something weird.
What I learned from your book that I never knew was the television judge, Joe Brown. Say about that.
Okay. Again, and that's something I would have liked to have gotten more into. But yes, so Judge Joe Brown, which, funny enough, I watched the show for some period and I got a chance to talk to him for the book. He's an interesting character. But he, at the time, was a judge on the state court. And he was a criminal court judge. And so, he handled, one of James Earl Ray's appeals. Of course, James Earl Ray, ended up pleading guilty to Dr. King's assassination, but then he ended up becoming extremely litigious about it and, filed all these appeals and things. He had all these proceedings. And so one of them wound up in Judge Joe Brown's courtroom. And so Judge Joe Brown had charge of these claims about the ballistics and the weapon and testing whether the bullet, I guess maybe it was whether the gun that they recovered was the actual gun that was used in the murder or was this some kind of, dummy gun. And Judge Joe Brown never got a chance to complete that litigation because he ended up getting pulled off the case for whatever reason. And again, I didn't get that deep into why that happened. I do know, and this is in the book, that Andrew Young thought it was very suspicious. I agree, it is weird. It's just one of those weird little facts But there was a lot going on, and then, I mean, I don't know. I mean, and I don't mean to malign Judge Brown in any way, but I just know that there have been a lot, there was a lot happening in the background. But it is still odd. And then another odd thing, and I want to make sure I have my facts straight, because again, this is going beyond the scope of the book, but just to answer the question, just one of these weird, uncanny facts of many was that the judge who accepted the guilty plea for James Earl Ray ended up dying in chambers, was it? He ended up dying. And I don't know. It was just weird. Like it's a lot of weird stuff to happen in one kind of event, like surrounding one event.
So let me now transition as we get closer to our time for questions. Let me transition to thinking about Mac's motivation of being both working undercover for the Memphis police and going on to the CIA. Now, I've written about an African-American man who also worked against Martin Luther King Jr., and I've often thought about what is the motivation. You have a lot of amazing lines in this book, but you have this beautiful line where you have your dad, he's there April 3rd in the church at Mason Temple, where King is giving his last sermon. And it's storming outside, it's raining, and King's voice is thundering, and people are clapping. And you say that Mac gets caught up in this. He is moved by King talking about we as a people will get to the promised land. He's moved by this. And you have this beautiful line where you say the irony of Mac being caught up in this movement, but yet he's also working for the forces that are opposing this movement. So he finds himself wrapped up in this beautiful worship moment of praise and worship and of aspiration and struggle, but he's also undercover and he's working with the forces that are trying to stop this movement. So talk to us about that push and pull that you've been able to see in Mac, and talk his motivation and how he psychologically, emotionally handled this.
Yes, I mean, that has been, one of the toughest kind of topics to really, delve into. Like, how was he making sense of this for himself? Because on one hand, he supported the sanitation strike. Like, he agreed that the sanitation workers were being mistreated. He knew what it was like to be treated this way. Growing up in a sharecropping family that was, treated in the most degrading, racist manner. So there was no question. Like, he supported what they stood for. He supported what they were fighting for. He supported the civil rights movement. He supported Dr. King. So how did he reconcile that with working for the police department to provide them with information? And I mean, the best answer that I can come up with is that, I'm not sure that he did reconcile those things. I think he compartmentalized those things. And to me, it speaks to this idea of double consciousness, as articulated by W.E.B. Du Bois, where as Black people, but as Americans, we have these warring ideals, in our head. Like, and also, thinking further about this, I think that my dad had one idea of what law enforcement was all about and what law and order were about that was very different from what law enforcement's idea of law and order were about. Like, my dad took law and order to mean what those words mean on their face, law and order, like the same rules apply to everybody else, right? And that people are protected from folks who want to encroach on them. But law enforcement was really looking at it not so much as law and order, but the current social order as the law. Like, it was the law of the order, And so that meant upholding the status quo. That was something that he didn't know going into it. but what he learned through bitter experience.
And he's say a little bit about some of the bitter experiences. A little bit about the bitter experiences. There are several times in this book where you point out his belief in law and order and working for law enforcement and justice and equality. He often bumps up against white supremacy, even in his own career, at every level. So could you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that his story, and really the story of the Invaders as well, as you know, certainly Dr. King and Ambassador Young, what they illustrate is the price that people pay when they confront these power structures in various ways, whether they're working within these oppressive systems or they're working from outside of these oppressive systems. There's a price to pay, whether it's the ultimate price of your life, whether it's being put into the criminal justice system and, you know, having a criminal record because you are outside of the system and you're protesting, or if you're within the system, as my dad was, and, you know, you're just trying to have a life, you know, you're just trying to be free and have a career like everybody else, that too is considered a threat. You know, not so much just because merely of your presence as a black person, but what you're trying to do and trying to have agency. And you're wearing a uniform that says essentially what the sanitation workers' protest signs said, which is, I am a man, meaning I am a human being. When you're wearing a uniform and you have a badge and you're a commissioned officer, that is considered a threat. And so there are people who are going to penalize you for trying to achieve something, trying to have human dignity. And so, yeah, he wasn't getting promoted at all. He saw that there was a ceiling for black officers, which is why he decided, I got to get out of here. Like, I'm not going to spend the rest of my career and my days being a patrolman. So, you know, the place to go where you're going to have some opportunities is the federal government, you know. And so what about the Federal Bureau of Investigation? Now, there's a good opportunity for black people, he thought. What little did he know. If y'all haven't read Dr. Martin's book, you can see why no. And it didn't work out for my father at all. And now I understand better than ever why that did not work out. J. Edgar Hoover, no, they were not hiring black people in that way for the most part. So he ended up getting a tip. And this is also kind of a mysterious situation. But anyway, there's a guy who was doing ride-alongs with the police department and, you know, was kind of keeping tabs on, you know, different officers. And so he asked my dad, you know, what about that FBI application? How's that going? And my dad said, well, I hadn't heard anything. And so this guy was like, well, the folks you really ought to apply with are the Central Intelligence Agency. That's where the opportunity is. And so then they end up having this conversation that's kind of like my dad's conversation with his cousin Eugene. Like, they're not going to hire any black people at the CIA. The guy's like, well, you don't know that. You ought to go try, you know. So he's like, well, how am I going to apply to be a CIA officer? And the guy said, just write him a letter, you know, write him a query letter, state what you're interested in, what your background is. And so my dad's like, and then what? And he says, and send it to CIA, Langley, Virginia. Like Santa Claus, North Pole. But he did it and it worked and he became a CIA officer. And I mean, that really, you know, looking back, that was the best career that he had. Though he still confronted the same structural barriers, racist barriers there that he had in, you know, the Memphis police officer that people have confronted, you know, in all types of workplaces, I mean, to this day.
Let me ask you two more questions and we'll turn to the audience. The first is a bit about the legacy of this book, but also the legacy of Mac. So the first is this amazing line that you have about writing this book. You say on page 282, I suppose someone else may have tried to tell the story if I'd let it go. Not that Dad would have cooperated. That prospect alone was a good reason to step in. Not only did I not want to see more lies, half-truths, and speculation about him, I didn't want him treated without care, handled as a curiosity and mined for content. So many Black figure stories are exploited this way. Look at this cool person, history, music I've discovered, or look how this person helped me to connect with my humanity. It's like the storytelling version of colonialism. The documentation of a history creates authority, hence the word author. And in our society, authority isn't often allowed to Black people. It's a beautiful paragraph. So tell me about that. So now you are the author/authority. What do you think, in light of where we find ourselves today in law enforcement, Black Lives Matter, police brutality, what do you think this story tells us about the moment we find ourselves? And even thinking about, if you don't mind, thinking about your children, especially the teenagers, as they're becoming young men of color, moving through the world, thinking about informants and Black Lives Matter and all types of things that are happening in our society. What do you think, as the author authority on this issue, what does this book say to us, and what does Max say to us today?
I think the book shows that not that much has changed at all. Less than one might hope. We still have these structural barriers of oppression in law enforcement. Even as we have made some progress. The progress has been made. That's undeniable. But we have a long way to go. Back actually shortly before Dr. King was assassinated, this Kerner Commission report came out about urban unrest. And, they found that what was fueling the unrest was inequality, lack of economic opportunities, lack of housing, all these different barriers, like new barriers across the board. Those barriers still exist. In some ways, some of them may have actually gotten worse. If you start looking at economics, and opportunities. So I think the book shows that not that much has changed, and we can't keep doing the same things and expecting a different result. I think the book also shows the ways in which people are working within oppressive systems and outside of oppressive systems to try to get free. There's often this debate, can you change the system from inside? And I think that this book shows that, there are people pushing from outside, but also from inside. And that's a good thing. I think, we're in an all hands on deck situation. But at the same time, you need decision makers who are going to support those folks who want to make change, or else nothing will happen. And all too often, the folks who want to make change are not going to get to be decision makers because of how they're penalized for making waves. And then I think for my children, just on a personal level, they know that their grandfather, they don't need to be afraid of that story with respect to him, that he's someone to be proud of. He's someone who lived a life of duty, who really believed in the true meaning of law and order, not in the perverted meaning that all too often has been a reality. And, he has carried himself and moved in the world honorably, and that, he's a person of faith. He's still alive, and he continues to just astound me with, the way that he lives and what he does. He devotes his time now to social causes in a way that he was not free to do in his previous careers. But he's a person of faith, that throughout his life has acted not only without, any kind of guarantee of a personal benefit to himself, but actually he has acted in ways where he was almost guaranteed to face ramifications. Like he's acted to his detriment, but because he wanted to do the right thing. So I think that's what the book means.
You have this beautiful line about him. The CIA's unofficial motto is on the headquarters lobby on the wall. It says, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free," from the Bible. And you say about Mac, all his life, freedom had been his lodestar, the goal of his strivings. It wasn't an abstract concept, but something real that could be felt and experienced, like lungs filled with air and vegetables sprouting from earth. It's beautiful. Last question. I'll put you in the position of being Mac. We know what you say about Mac. What does Mac say about Mac?
Mac doesn't say much about Mac. He is not a person who seeks the limelight, which, in some ways, makes him a perfect undercover type of person. No, he is so humble. What he has said is that, well, because the last question that I asked him, in researching the book, I conducted these years of interviews with him, like from 2015 through last year. And the last question that I asked him was like, so, in all of our conversations, everything that we've talked about, is there anything else, that you want people to know or understand about your life, your choices, what it is that you stand for? And he said, what I want people to know and understand is what you have written in this manuscript. He had read the manuscript. And so to me, that meant that no matter what happened in the marketplace, to me, the book is a success because it has done what I intended, which was to tell the truth and just tell it straight. And, readers can draw their own conclusions, but the book essentially is what Mac says about Mac. So,
please join me in thanking our author. So we have about 20, 25 minutes for questions. I think instead of me trying to run through the rows here and tripping and falling, if you could just say your question really loud, and for the recording, I'll repeat it in the microphone. So I'm happy to acknowledge folks for questions. We'll start right here.
What were your challenges as a daughter in your relationship with him, your ability to tell the story of this black spy you had in your life? What challenges were presented by that?
So let me just repeat it for the recording. The question was, what are some of the challenges you had in telling this story, as the fact that you're writing about your father, who is a black spy? Yeah,
one might think that the challenge would be to be objective and kind of look at it from an arm's length kind of, perspective. That really wasn't that much of a challenge, just because, and part of this was driven by the gigantic silence about the assassination, but we really were not that close on a personal level. My parents divorced when I was 3. And so, I would see him, maybe once or twice a year. Being a CIA officer, he was gone for these long stretches, and then he'd come into town, and then I'd see him. But, I didn't grow up with him being a constant presence. And then when we would have conversations, after I was an adult and everything, they just really couldn't go that far below the surface because there was so much below the surface that just seemed untouchable. So it's just like, how are you doing? So I was actually able to be pretty objective. And then, of course, I was trained as a lawyer. And so I was kind of approaching it. I really did just try to put on my litigator hat. So I was like, I need to depose him, the challenges as a daughter. But having said all that, I guess there was the challenge of really wanting to believe the best at all times. And so, I just had to play devil's advocate in my own mind, which led to some, awkward conversations with him and, interviews, because I'm constantly thinking, like, I can't just be throwing softball questions at him, and taking his word for things. I was having to challenge things that he said, or like, okay, well, you said this, but what about that? Like, I just don't know. I mean, I never told him I wasn't buying something that he said, but, there were moments where I'm like, really? Well, what about, this, that, and the other? So, I mean, just having to take an adversarial stance against my father at times. I mean, that adversarial is probably a little bit strong, but I mean, it really was just trying to, having to look at him through a critical lens in these conversations, I would say was somewhat difficult as a daughter, but not as difficult as it could have been. Like, to do this with my mom, I mean, that probably would have been impossible. Like, that would have been harder. She raised me, but with him, it wasn't as much of a challenge. I mean, now we're super close, so yeah. But it's because I did all of the investigation, so.
Other questions? Right here in front, please.
On that same note, how did your dad feel about you writing this book?
Funny enough, so when I broached this topic in a very inelegant way, just out of the blue, one day in 2010, I just called him up, and I'm home with the baby, and I'm like, hey, Dad, how you doing? Yeah, so, we never talked about the assassination of Dr. King. And I'm sure he's like, what? And, it's just kind of like these long silences. And I said, I want to know the story. I want to know what happened, because I don't know. And also, it's bigger than just me and knowing and, our family, but this is history. Like, this is unknown history. And so I think it's important. And I also think we need to document it. Like, whatever you say, we need to, like, write this down. Like, it needs to be a book. And so he was silent for a couple of beats. And then he kind of laughed, and he was like, well, that's a lot, And I also asked him if he would tell me about his upbringing, which was something else he never talked about. And he said, well, I'll tell you what, why don't you let me write some notes about it, and I'll send you the notes, and you can read those, and we'll just start there. And shortly thereafter, he sent me this Word document, 17 pages of notes, Courier font. And, but I think, because you asked me, how did he feel about that? I mean, my sense is, it's a phone conversation, so, my perception of him is sort of limited through the medium of telephone, but my sense was that he was kind of relieved. Like, okay, finally we can just get into this. So I think he was relieved.
We'll go in the back to the chairman of the Department of Communication.
Oh.
Thanks. You opened the book with a quote from Aeschylus that Robert F. Kennedy used the night of the assassination in Indianapolis. I was wondering, is Robert F. Kennedy a hero of yours, or why did you choose that quote?
So, yes, I chose that quote because in researching the assassination, I discovered that he had used that quote in talking about Dr. King's assassination, and it immediately put me in the mind of my dad's story and the wisdom coming drop by drop, even against his will, by the awesome grace of God. And, connecting these ideas of wisdom and pain and grace, the awful grace of God. And I thought, well, if that doesn't encapsulate what is in those pages and how, a life lived in this manner does bring this wisdom in ways that one would not elect.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I really look forward to reading your book, particularly because I moved to Memphis. I lived in Memphis from 68 to 72.
Oh, my.
I didn't know your father's story, of course, but nobody did. I did know some of the people who were in the Invaders, and I think one of the, I wonder if one of the motivations that helps explain what your father did is that the Invaders were really demonized, and it was presented as though the threat of violence was just around the corner. And so so it changes things. There's a documentary out now on the Invaders where they get to explain themselves, and they were clearly very thoughtful, as we've seen about the Panthers, for example, very thoughtful about what they were doing. They differed with King on the question of violence as an option or not, but even King himself had come to the point of view, he had talked with them in the days right before he was killed, and he also understood he didn't demonize them. They were demonized by the society around. So I think that's a very important, and we continue to do that, of course, demonizing the people that we are going to claim are about to do violence, and then that justifies an overreaction. So I think that's very important.
That's a great point. And in fact, that was part of what my father said, was that I'm collecting information because there are these stories. There's a reporter in Memphis, Kay Pittman Black, who worked for the Memphis Commercial Appeal, and she published these sensationalized stories of the invaders, making them seem, like this threat to, social order. It's kind of like what happens today with Antifa, or BLM, Black Lives Matter. They were demonized. That's right. Now, what's interesting, though, is that, they also did want to project this larger than life image themselves. So in some ways, they wanted to feed into that. But at the same time, my father's position was, well, I'm just here to find out what's real and what's not. And what he concluded was, these guys are not dangerous at all. And I actually have a chapter where I talked to Kobe Smith, who was one of the organizers. Yeah, great. Love Kobe Smith. And, he was so open and candid about what they were trying to accomplish, and they really were fighting for, Black people's autonomy, dignity, cultural pride. At the same time, he told me, we were at lunch at Outback Steakhouse on Madison or something, and he said, well, we were trying to stop the trucks. We wanted to stop those garbage trucks. And I said, yeah, well, that's the kind of information my dad was looking for. So, no, it's too bad he didn't. Anyway, whatever.
But I think that's what's fascinating in this conversation, allow me to just jump in for a second, is that is partially the media, but also that is also we know what the FBI was doing. Mm-hmm. The FBI was deliberately trying to leak its information to shape the public narrative around these groups, and that King was just this big troublemaker. You point out in the book about during the first march, the invaders are accused of starting the violence downtown. Your father is saying that it was not the invaders, it was somebody else. But the story goes in the Commercial Appeal. The FBI runs with it. And the fact that King stays in a formerly all-white hotel, they use that as an example to say, look at King. He starts this violence, then he goes off and stays in this fancy hotel. The FBI had all of this. They used this information, really what we could see today as disinformation in some ways, right? This is what you point out so well. This is, in some ways, the beginnings, we could argue, of disinformation, at least on a modern level. So this is really important. I really appreciate you raising that. Question right here.
Yeah, through the years, conversations through the King Center, you said that King suspected that was going to be his last day. He was going to die that day. Did you hear or get any feel for that when talking to your dad or through your investigation?
Yeah, Andrew Young, I spoke with him, and so he had that sense that Dr. King felt like something was going to happen. Yeah, my dad did not have a sense of that. He was in one of those meetings that the Invaders had with Dr. King, and but he didn't gather anything in particular about Dr. King other than he radiated peace. He was just his presence in the room, But yes, Andrew Young did say that Dr. King felt that it was coming.
Yes.
I wanted, at the beginning of the discussion, you talked about looking up your father online and seeing that there were a lot of conspiracy theories around his possible involvement in the shooting. Is that something that you spoke to your dad about, and kind of what was his feeling about the disinformation that was surrounding his involvement
Yeah, that was one of the more delicate topics because, I mean, this was, an almost 7-year process of interviews. And so I thought, well, I don't want to lead with something that's so disturbing. So let's just tell me about your childhood, And so that's the first 6 months or whatever. And then, we lead into these other things. But in terms of the conspiracy theories and how we felt about it, we did get into that because there was a book that was published that someone brought to my father. Actually, one of my dad's coworkers at the CIA was in an airport and picked up a book and was like, oh, that looks interesting. And he starts reading it and he's like, hey, that's one of my colleagues. So he brought the book to my dad and it's all about, this conspiracy theory. And it's saying that my dad was involved in this murder. And so my dad was really angry about it, that somebody could print lies, print unfounded information, and make money off of it. It makes him angry, but at the same time, he is a person of faith. So he just takes the position that, well, all I can do is what I can do. I can't control what people think. Hopefully they have enough sense not to listen to, crackpots. But either way, I'm just going to live my life honorably and it'll all shake out. I, though, think and sense that, in addition to the trauma of seeing Dr. King murdered and being there, I think that it was traumatic for him to have run up into this active shooter situation to try to render first aid and then wind up getting accused of being involved in that very murder. I think that must be intensely painful. But I think to have the story, the real story out there has got to be profoundly healing as well.
And you point out that he had to testify before the United States Congress twice.
Well, he testified before the Congress and then he had to go talk to the Department of Justice. That's right. And interestingly enough, Congress, the Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s, they seemed to be pointing the finger at the invaders, saying, implying that perhaps they were on the FBI, payroll or somehow, being used in these nefarious ways. So there's just so much suspicion all around, such a cloud, around so many people.
Yes, please.
My understanding is that invaders were a bunch of young youth group. At what age did your father join them, and how difficult was it for him to join? And did any other members of the FBI were doing the police department was doing similar things? And also wanted to know if police compensate him for financially for putting him perhaps a more dangerous spot. If not.
Yes. Okay. Let me answer those backwards, I guess. He never tried to intervene with what they did. In fact, he was very cognizant that, I am just to listen and report, observe and report back. I cannot get involved in what they do. I'm not going to stop what they do, but I certainly am not going to be the idea guy. I'm going to be the Minister of Transportation. I'm the patsy with a car. I just want to be in their orbit. Which, to answer your first question, how hard was it for him to be an invader? It was super easy because he was a young guy of 23. And so he had a great car. And, there weren't that many of them that had cars, maybe a couple. So it was easy. He was young. They were young, from late teens to early, 20s, mid 20s. So he fit right in. And actually Kobe Smith, one of their, lead organizers, had said that he was one of the best invaders that they had because he was very dependable. He was a very professional person. So, that part went well. Was he compensated additionally for this undercover work? Absolutely not. He couldn't even get promoted after he'd done all this work, and his cover ends up getting blown. So he's overtly in the police department. He never got acknowledged for it. He just got his regular patrolman little pay, No, there was very little care given to him, to his safety, I'm trying to think, have I addressed all of your questions? I hope I have. Yes. So yeah, pretty easy to be an invader, which argues against the dangerousness of this group. Like, you know. Oh, there one more. Yeah, there was. After my dad became, you know, after his cover was blown and he went back, you know, overtly to the police department, he did learn that there was another police officer, black officer, embedded in the Invaders. And so he learned that he was assigned this name or this code name, Agent 500. That was my dad. So this other guy was Agent 501. I know. This is all so difficult to crack. Difficult, I know.
You know, the other story that you point out that connects to this is when he's also goes to Memphis State, and the police department and the FBI want him to be embedded in Black Student Organization, Black Student Association, as well as the Students for Democratic Society. And you point out that he ends up befriending a white co-ed, and they kind of have some flirtation, and they're holding hands on campus. And then she comes to campus crying because the FBI went to her father and said, your daughter's running around with this radical black dude. And so even, it's an amazing book, but even just to the point about, you point out so well, he's working for these individuals. Not only is he not getting compensated for this dangerous work, but he's having to deal with not feeling supported. And also they're going around him, and then the racism involved in it. So he's reporting to the FBI, but they're still committed to a certain kind of status quo that you pointed to, especially around issues around romance.
Absolutely. And it was just one of those baffling things. Like, he can't believe the FBI knows fully, you know, what he's doing, the role that he's playing. And yes, you know, in order to infiltrate the Students for a Democratic Society, which was what everybody had agreed was the plan, he was going to get friendly with these white students. But the problem was he got too friendly with one of the women, and they didn't like that. And so even knowing, you know, the fact that they'd put him out there to do this job, they still couldn't stand it.
Please.
Purely for discussion, is there any remorse expressed by your father for the role that he had with the police department? After watching George Floyd, you see men of color that were there also that man was murdered. Their role is to sit there and support the police, support very oppressive action. And I'm sure at some point he said, I'm going to make things better. But at what point do you recognize you're not having an impact? This system just keeps grinding on. Has he expressed any remorse in having ever been there and thinking that he could make a change?
I asked him that question. And, you know, the way that he looks at it was, I did not do anything wrong. Now, the way that I look at it is, you know, he's 23 years old. He was clearly in over his head. He did not have the perspective to understand what he was getting involved in. And I mean, really, it was only after like these huge investigations at the, you know, highest levels of government that we realized what was going on with COINTELPRO. I mean, there was actually like a theft of documents, right, that uncovered this whole scheme. So he only had one little piece of this bigger picture that he was embroiled in. So to me, it's kind of like, you know, this, you have these, anti-democratic forces, you know, these forces that are against freedom, that are working to suppress people's expression of their First Amendment rights. And you have this undercurrent that exists in law enforcement, but you can't necessarily see that on the surface. It's like a riptide. So you're out there, you're swimming with the current. You know, my dad's out there going with the flow of the police department. And then all of a sudden, he hits that riptide. And now, you know, he's in something way bigger than he ever would have imagined. I also touched on this when I talked to one of the former invaders, Kobe Smith. And, he said, what I heard him to say was that, he didn't, I know that he does not hold any kind of grudge or bear any ill will toward these folks. And what he said was, he only takes issue with people who took actions that led to harm. And so I think looking at my dad's actions through, the lenses of intention and actual impact, his intention was clearly to uphold law and order as they mean, as this concept sort of should mean. And the impact, was there harm? Did he have a harmful impact? It's not clear to me that he did, for some of the reasons that we talked about, because again, the invaders were painted as this big boogeyman by going in and getting the facts and telling them, telling the police department that they weren't dangerous. Was some greater harm prevented? We don't know. They didn't come in there, guns blazing, as, happened in so many other instances, like Fred Hampton and all that stuff. That didn't happen in Memphis because my dad constantly told them they're not dangerous. So it's really hard to pick apart. And so I think it kind of brings us back to that Aeschylus quote at the beginning of the book. Through this process, he gained so much insight that he otherwise, how could he have gained this insight otherwise? So I'm not sure that there's room for regret. As a practical matter, one cannot go back and change it. All you can do is take what you've gained and try to make the best that you can of that and share the story with the world so that people can gain wisdom from it.
Would you mind sharing briefly about his conversation that you recorded with Andrew Young?
Yes. So Andrew Young, briefly. So he had been talking to one of my mom's colleagues at the Memphis Commercial Appeal. And so he had mentioned wanting to talk to my dad, to this colleague. Because, he also was on that balcony. No one had ever talked to my dad, other than these federal investigators. And so, and the Congress people, he wanted to talk to Dad. And so this reporter passed along this request to my mom, along with Andrew Young's phone number. And this was in an email that I had gotten at work back when I was, practicing law. And so I had this email. And so I remember calling my dad. And I was like, hey, there's this reporter that has passed along this request from Andrew Young, and I've got his phone number if you want to talk to him. And he's just kind of like, no, thanks. So I'm like, okay. So I just kept the email. I don't really delete emails that often anyway. So I just sat on the email, and I kept the email for years. And then, I start working on the book. And then I'm, in the middle of working on the book, I read this newspaper article. Actually, it's a tabloid article. I was reading a tabloid, and there's a story about how Ambassador Young had been in a car accident with a garbage truck, which is kind of like uncanny, and that he had been injured, and I was like, oh no, I never got a chance to talk to him. And now I'm writing this book. I might not get a chance. Nobody's getting younger. So I thought about this email, and I was like, well, I have his phone number. I'm just going to call him. So I just called him out of the blue, thinking I'm going to leave a message. And the person who answered the phone put him on the phone. I was like, oh, no. I haven't even prepared what I want to say. But anyway, I talked to him, and we had this conversation. I said, hey, I understand that you had wanted to speak with my father, and so I'm his daughter, and I just want to know, what did you want? What did you want to know? And so we ended up having this wide-ranging conversation where he says he wanted to tie up some loose ends. And he talks about the unanswered questions from the assassination. And so I just kind of blurted out, well, I want to know the truth. I want to know what happened. And he says, no, you don't. And of course, I'm just kind of like, and he goes on to say, I don't want to be in a position to think that people in the federal government murdered my friend. And so, we kind of talk a little bit more from there. It's all in the book. And then he gives me his cell phone number and tells me to have my dad call him day or night if he ever wants to talk. So I called up my dad after this, and I said, hey, I had this conversation and I have his cell phone number too. Do you want to talk to him? And he's like, no, thanks. So I'm like, great. And so things, just kind of go along. I'm working on the book. And then I end up talking to this writer named Hampton Sides, who wrote this great book about the assassination called Hellhound on His Trail, which I highly recommend if you're interested in the assassination. And so I'm talking to Hampton, and I mentioned Andrew Young, and he said, what if you could get them in a room together and just talk through? Like, that would be history. Like, that would be amazing. And it just inspired me to just take up the topic again. So I said, well, I'm just going to try again. And I called Dad, and I said, hey, do you want to talk to Andrew Young? This would be a really important conversation. And this time he agreed. And so we ended up going down to Atlanta and meeting with Ambassador Young in his home and having a very long, very profound conversation. And I think what changed for my dad was just that it took time, and it took he had to get to a certain comfort level to be able to reach the step of talking to Andrew Young. And so we got there just step by step.
And with that, please join me in thanking our guest.